Kia ora Aotearoa, good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight to discuss events is CTU economist Dr. Bill Rosenberg and Associate Professional Services Manager for the New Zealand Nurses Organisation, Hilary Graham-Smith. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, 0.6% GDP with 6.8% unemployment. How does the economy provide the momentum to create growth and secure jobs? Issue 2, are safe staffing and healthy workplaces being ignored for cost cutting? And issue 3, does the real cost of private prisons make a mockery of the public-private model? Plus we'll wrap with a final thought, but let's start the show with issue 1. Last week's growth of 0.6% GDP was higher than economists feared, but is near economic stagnation with high unemployment the best we can hope for? Bill, the government described this as solid and broad-based growth. Is that optimistic for Bill English?
And they also described it as grumpy growth, and he wasn't really sure whether it would continue.
Right.
And what we're seeing is 0.6 growth in that quarter, 1% in the first quarter, which is good news. But what we're seeing alongside it is increasing unemployment. So what we've got is jobless growth. And the question is how do we get jobs in the economy? Now we're starting to see Christchurch rebuild starting to ramp up. But even at its peak, one of the reports that I saw said there would be 27,000 new jobs here. We've got 162,000 people out of work nationally at the moment. Of those 27,000, over half could well be filled by immigrants. Now, I've got nothing against immigrants, but we really do need to see Christchurch rebuild as an opportunity for jobs, for training opportunities for people, help people to take part in that, make it a real spirit of a thing that people really want to get involved in, rather than just letting it happen. And the same applies to the rest of the economy. We won't get jobs, we won't get development that's sustainable, that's not just more milk, more dairy exports, unless the government really has a strategy around developing those jobs. And we could go on about that a bit if you'd like. I mean, for a start, for people out of work, we need to have decent programs that actually help them to retrain if necessary, to find jobs that are matching their skills, to relocate if necessary. A really good active labour market program as they have in Northern Europe. If we're going to actually build jobs, we need to think about how the government can help that, because it buys a lot of stuff. And it could be aiming that at Kiwi jobs. It could be, you know, we keep on thinking about the rolling stock that wasn't built here for the railways.
That's right.
There are a lot of programs like that we could use in rolling stock and IT and all sorts of things that are made and services that we've provided here that could be expanded and aimed at New Zealanders.
What happens to our grumpy growth if China has a hard landing?
Well, there are a lot of risks out there, and Bill English is good at doing the risks too, and he's quite right. There are a lot of risks out there. Europe is still looking sick. I was just reading that UK, which was meant to be one of the better ones, now is threatening to have a bigger budget deficit than Greece. Greece lost 20% of its GDP over the last year or two. Really disastrous. Those kinds of austerity programs.
Those black swans are coming home to roost.
They are, and then China, which depends on those countries for its exports, is starting to wind down too. Now it's not going to crash by any means, but there are big dangers there, both in its housing market and maintaining its level of growth, and that reflects both on us and on Australia, and we of course depend on Australia too.
Hilary, if the economy isn't creating jobs, how does the health sector cope with rising inequality and poverty?
Well, I don't think we cope very well, because whilst we're not able to deliver if we have unsafe staffing levels, we're not able to deliver the care that people require, and that just simply continues the whole inequitable situation that New Zealanders are experiencing in terms of access to healthcare. Do
people front with worse symptoms or worse medical situations because of poverty?
Yes, absolutely they do. They delay going to see the doctor because of the cost or difficulty with access, and it's not always just cost, it's things like transport. All of those sorts of things to contribute to them not accessing care when they really need to or should.
We saw a recent report that nurses in New Zealand are feeling ethically challenged because they're not able to provide for the care of their patients because of cost cutting. How much more stress do you think the health sector can take?
I don't think they can take very much more at all, Martin. That was Martin Wood's research out of Massey University talking about moral distress.
Yes, yeah.
And that's the absolute anguish that nurses feel when they're not able to deliver the care that they know patients deserve and should have, and that they really want to give. So on a daily basis, we hear from our members stories of inadequate staffing situations. And when a nurse says to you, I've just had 2 days off, but I'm feeling really scared about going back because we're so poorly staffed, I'm just waiting for something bad to happen, the alarm bells ring fairly resoundingly. So we are experiencing and observing and hearing of difficulties on a daily basis that nurses are experiencing in the workplace.
Do nurses feel that they have got the work security, the job security, to be able to go to one of their managers and say, look, I don't believe that we are looking after our patients well enough, that cost cutting is actually impacting on the health, the services that we can provide them for their health and their well-being? Do they feel supported enough to be able to do that sort of thing? Well,
I think there's a number of issues there because the managers are being squeezed as well in terms of more patients through the pipeline all of the time. Certainly nurses do raise it in terms of writing incident reports, but they think that that's largely a futile exercise because nothing changes.
Right.
So that's a real concern for them. They don't necessarily feel listened to.
Yep. Bill, solid energy miners are marching today in protest at economic policy that's making their jobs less secure. What does the government need to do macroeconomically to bring down the currency and give exporting and manufacturing jobs a chance in New Zealand? What do we need to do?
Well, certainly the exchange rate is a very major problem, and the more and more economists are saying we need to do something about it, even quite conservative ones. To me, the core of the problem for New Zealand lies in the capital that comes across our borders from overseas, seeking higher interest rates in New Zealand, and actually at the moment a comparatively stable economy. And when all this money floods into New Zealand, it pushes up the exchange rate. Now, so what we have to do is somehow control that flow of money. Now, you can do that in a number of ways. One is through what's called rather mysteriously the core funding ratio that the Reserve Bank has brought in for banks. And that was really to give them a smack on the hand because in the build-up to the global financial crisis, they were using huge amounts of short-term funding from international money markets, and that just dried up with the global financial crisis. So they said, never again. But we could actually use that quite actively we could certainly look at using it quite actively to control that flow of money into the country. Other methods are available. One of them, of course, is financial transactions tax. That would reduce the returns of these overseas investors.
While generating revenue for the New Zealand government.
While generating revenue. So that might be useful. And there are other methods of actually controlling those capital flows.
So when the government just shrugs and goes, there's nothing we can do, it's the free market, get used to it, that's a nonsense argument.
Well, and I think it's worse than that. I mean, it's not only a nonsense argument, but it's actually pandering to the financial sector.
Right.
And when I was on a debate on another broadcaster, another public interest broadcaster the other day, up against a bank economist, and his answer was microeconomic reform. The Prime Minister's answer is more flexible labour force. Now, all of these things are saying, if you don't do something about the exchange rate, what you're going to have is cuts in public services. You're going to have worse pay and working conditions for people. So it's going to actually reflect on ordinary New Zealanders rather than the financial sector taking some of the responsibility for it.
Hilary, why does the NZNO support a living wage? Can we afford it in a recession?
Well, I think we have to afford it. You know, people are entitled to decent jobs and a decent wage in return for doing that work. So we absolutely have to find a way to plan for growth in the economy, and not necessarily using consultants, but using people like unions, like industry, like business leaders to talk about what that plan should look like. You know, certainly we in nursing are becoming more and more reliant on an overseas trained workforce, and because we don't incentivise our own New Zealand trained nurses and doctors to stay here.
So we're still training our nurses and they're still going overseas?
They surely are.
And what are we doing to bring them back?
Well, in some instances, we actually know that they don't come back, and we have this funny little idea that, of course, every New Zealander that pops off overseas for a bit of work experience comes back, but more and more we're finding that those nurses that go abroad are not coming back.
Final question to both of you on this. Does the reignition of the Ports of Auckland dispute, now the pretensive process has expired, suggest the type of tactics employers are going to start using or resorting to in this recession? Is that the kind of heavying tactics we're going to start seeing?
Well, clearly, in both the Ports of Auckland and the AFCO case, we saw exactly the same tendency, wanting to contract out, wanting to get rid of the current workforce, wanting to get rid of any unions in the workforce. And what's really scary about this is that the government's current next round of changes to the Employment Relations Act is exactly matched to that. So what's rather obscurely called the duty to conclude, which is part of these changes, is a current requirement on employers once they enter into collective bargaining, that they, unless they have a very good reason, they have to conclude those negotiations.
They've got a responsibility to
They have a responsibility, that's right. Now, in the Auckland dispute, if you just think if that duty to keep those discussions going wasn't there, they'd have just within days or weeks have said to the people working in that port, out you go, we're going to put in contractors. So it gives a huge encouragement to employers to pursue these bad work practices.
With Tony Ryle telling the DHPs they're going to just have to find the money anyway, we're going to have much more squeezing coming on to health maybe for the first time in this 4-year government. Are we going to see more pressure on nursing?
Oh, we absolutely are seeing it already. And the bottom line here is actually that nurses nurse people, not beds. And so thinking about empty beds and filling them full of people requiring elective surgery. I mean, certainly we want to see New Zealanders get their elective surgery, but at what cost? We should be able to say to them that you're going to have that surgery in a safe and well-staffed environment.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, are safe staffing and healthy workplaces being ignored for cost cutting? Hilary, the NZNO criticised a move last month by the Capital and Coast DHB to take healthcare services away from those who needed it most at a secret board meeting. Will we see more of this type of health regionalisation occurring?
Well, we are seeing it already. I think that what happens in terms of, for instance, hospital care, our nurses have to prioritise what care and what care they can and can't give in any given shift. And so this is called missed care. It's well written up in the literature by people like Beatrice Kalish from the States. We've got lots and lots of evidence that this goes on, and it's kind of fundamental things that get let go first. So it's mobilising patients, patient hygiene, and what we see there is an outcome for the patient is often an increased length of stay because of things like pneumonia developing as a result of not being mobilised.
So cutting costs actually costs us more than the
of course it does. We hear so much about productivity, but is it productive for nurses to be pushing beds around wards and answering telephones while we continue to pump more people down the pipeline? That's not productive.
Bill, the Health and Safety Task Force released an issue paper last week focusing on an appallingly high workplace and injury rates, with 5 times the workplace injury rate than the UK. What's going wrong with our work sites?
Well, I'm on that task force, so I want to keep a bit of an open mind about what needs to be done. But clearly there's something hugely wrong. As you say, I mean, it's actually 6 times the UK injury rate. It's 4 times their fatality rate, and could well be more than that. So we're clearly doing something wrong. The target the government has set the workforce is to reduce it by 25%, but then we'd still have 3 times the fatality rate of the UK. So
are we just not safety conscious? What's going on?
Well, there might be some of that. I think that there is it's widely considered, even amongst business people, that there's actually an incentive on many businesses when they're competing for business to say, health and safety, that's one thing we can skimp on.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's a policy failure? I mean, if that's the equation they're coming to, that's going to be a policy failure. And
for many small businesses, and many of those are the ones who are in these very competitive situations, they find it quite hard to understand what is required out of our current, what's called performance-based health and safety legislation, which says you must take all practicable steps
That's right.
to to avoid harm to your workers.
But what's practical?
And exactly, it's
Right.
very difficult for an employer who's got lots of other things on their minds, very
Sure.
little specialist knowledge in health and safety to
Sure.
understand that. And so, some degree of prescription, codes of practice, those kinds of things may very well be not only good for the workers in those workplaces, but for the employers to do a better job and feel easier about how they're getting along with it.
Yeah.
But there's a whole range of other things that we also need to look at. For example, worker participation is absolutely essential,
Yeah.
and it's actually a right in the sense that it's the workers, it's not employers, but it's the workers who lose their fingers and their arms and their lives. And so they must have a say in what goes on there. And we know that when workers representatives have got the right to do things like stop work and to insist that the employer put improvement notices over the employer to
Lift their
get
game.
rid of a hazard or isolate it or whatever. That those are present in those rights are present, for example, in Australia and in the UK. And we also know that unions being in the workplace actually help health and safety. So there's a whole lot of things there that actually were not properly done in the 2002 Act. Some of them part of that whole deregulation of our employment rights. And there was not nearly enough put in place in the way of stronger enforcement, better inspectorate, and all the regulations and codes of practice that are actually needed to back up this form of legislation.
Are you confident right now that if a New Zealand worker on a work site didn't feel safe and actually thought that the work site was hazardous, that they could stop work, make a complaint and not risk their job the next day?
I think that's a very real problem. They have that right.
Yep.
But for a lot of them, it's just the same as in the hospital and probably even worse, because for many of them, they really are worried about their jobs and are worried about complaining about anything.
Sure.
And they don't want to get labelled as whingers because they're talking about health and safety. And so these things just don't get reported. If they do get reported, there's no way that they can feel that they can actually make sure that something is actually done.
So that worker will be going back on the work site, probably in the knowledge that that work site is still unsafe.
That's right, and I think that that happens quite frequently.
Hilary, we're seeing massive school closures and mergers in Christchurch for those workers. Safe staffing level and healthy workplaces just don't exist. When the job cutbacks are so large in this recession, do you think staffing levels and healthy workplaces have just become a luxury?
No, absolutely not, and they should never be considered as a luxury. I mean, we have some excellent resources and tools that have been developed by the Safe Staffing Healthy Workplaces Unit. If you think that the report from that inquiry came out in around 2005, 2006. The unit's been in place sort of 2007, 2009-ish, but we're still struggling to get traction. We have got some DHBs that have jumped on board and they're reaping the benefits.
Right.
So we have an acuity tool that will measure and tell us what the hours per patient per day requirement in terms of staffing is. Those things are there. We just need to get more traction with the DHBs.
Right. Do you feel that the government appreciates our public health system enough? I mean, we see with public education they don't seem to appreciate public education as much. Are they appreciative of how good a job we do for the money that we put into for our public health system?
Well, they love publishing statistics, but
right.
in actual fact they don't necessarily tell the story, do
right.
they? And I think what we're seeing, and particularly in our public hospitals with lower staffing levels, is a complete lack of respect for the complexity of the work that nurses and midwives do.
Really?
You know, that's the impression you'd have to take, and really a lack of respect for the rights of every New Zealander to have safe and effective care.
Yeah. Bill, how are national standards creating healthy workplaces for teachers? How is that helping their day-to-day challenges in front of schools?
I suspect that it's a very similar situation for them as to what Hilary's just described for nurses in this kind of stressful situation they're set up, where they don't believe that these are the right things to do professionally, and yet there's huge pressure on them to carry out things that many and a majority of educationalists say this is actually not the right way to go about it. So I think this is a huge problem. And what Fairfax is now doing about putting these league tables, it just rubs salt into the wound and makes it very difficult for schools who are actually doing a damn good job. I mean, our kids went to a school, and I don't know, was it decile 2 or 3 area. I thought they got a very good education there. But very possibly that school wouldn't show up well in these tables simply because kids come along to there from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's not the absolute results that count, is how those kids move through the school that counts, and that's not measured by these
Final
standards.
question to both of you on this. Will any of the government suggested industrial laws do anything to make workplaces safer?
Well, we don't have an indication of that at this stage, so that's pretty scary.
Anything coming
well,
up from
the new laws that they're bringing in are just going to introduce new tensions and worry into the workplace. So
and make it more difficult for unions to get onto those workplaces
that's right,
in the first place,
we will certainly be opposing those. We would like to see something coming out of this health and safety task force, and certainly we're taking the government at its word that wants to do something serious there, and certainly encourage people to make submissions to that.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. This month, Serco told the London Stock Exchange that they would be making $29 million per year from their private prisons in New Zealand. This is on top of the $900 million cost of building the private prison at Whitty in the first place. Bill, does the real cost of private prisons make a mockery of this public-private model?
Well, the evidence from the UK is that the way that Serco and the like make money out of private prisons is that they cut experienced staffing and they cut wages. So in the end, it's the workers in those prisons that are taking the pain for these changes.
And that's resulted in many more beatings in those prisons, hasn't it? You've got inexperienced guards who are losing their rag with prisoners, and you're getting abuse occurring.
It's very interesting because Serco is running the Mount Eden facility now.
That's right.
And they've one of the things they did in setting that up is to set up a whole lot of indicators that they have to adhere to.
That's right.
And they're falling behind even on those, even just this short period of time. And some of them quite important things like suicides and
not letting prisoners out.
That's right, and management plans for the prisoners and that kind of thing. Serco have got a dreadful reputation in other countries, like including Australia, and detention in these refugee centres and so on. I'm not sure why we would want to have people like that running our prisons.
Hilary, we have $29 million for a private prison, but not enough money to feed kids before they become inmates in that private prison. Is there something terribly out of kilter here with our spending
programs? There is something terribly out of
kilter.
kilter. The state has to step up and accept responsibility for running the justice system and the penal system. And yes, the money that's being spent on that, on building yet another private prison, this time in New Zealand, is absolutely deplorable, considering what's happening to children in Christchurch around their schools and to vulnerable children across the country. How many more reports and how much more research do we have to do before we actually start taking action for these kids?
Bill, isn't having ACC invest into private prisons a bit like having hospitals investing into gambling trusts? I mean, don't you become addicted to a source of income that you don't want to be promoting in the first place?
And I mean, that's one of the worries that some of the experts have, that when you have private prisons, there's actually a lobby there for increased numbers of prisoners. And so it's for toughening up the laws that lead to people being imprisoned, and
we know how politically sexy that is.
Well, it is. But even Bill English says it's bad socially and it's bad fiscally, but they carry on with it. So it's actually setting up all the wrong tensions in society there.
Hilary, it was reported last week that Serco gave the NHS in Britain false data about its GP services 252 times. Shouldn't private contractors be under the same level of scrutiny as publicly funded ones?
Absolutely, they should. I mean, even if privatisation costs the same here, can we rely on their accountability, and can we rely on their quality? Seemingly not.
Final question on this: when Whitty is open, New Zealand will have the highest proportion in the world of prisoners in private prisons. How has this managed to happen with zero discussion in society about the ramifications of making corporate profit out of incarceration? How has that happened here?
Well, I think the government just has a program, and you can see it right throughout government of increasing private provision in all sorts of areas. I mean, the most obvious is the state asset sales, obviously, but in provision of social welfare, in contracting out of public, of the core government departments, the advice and that kind of thing. Whole list of areas they're bringing in these kinds of private provision, whether that's formally a public-private partnership or an asset sale. It's all over the place. It's just part of that philosophy.
Has this been privatisation by stealth on prisons?
Well, I suspect that the discussion's been occurring for some time, but yes, it's kind of crept up on New Zealanders, as they often do, with something that they know is going to be completely unpopular. It's certainly very worrying that Serco has such a bad track record, and yet we're continuing to go down that path. Yeah.
That's it for the show, ladies and gentlemen, but let's wrap it finally with a final word. Bill, your final word this weekend.
Well, I was fascinated by how weekly Paula Bennett was defending the attacks on beneficiaries in Q&A on the weekend. And one fascinating one figure that really I think tells the story is this: that they say that they want to reduce the number of beneficiaries by 46,000.
That's right.
Now, if you look back, we were less than that. We'd cut. We had 46,000 and more less back in 2006, 2007. That was because we had low unemployment, essentially. So we could reduce the number of beneficiaries to the levels that the government's aiming for without having to bash them, simply by getting employment back into the economy, by reducing unemployment. And that, to me, tells a big story, that the government simply has its eye on the wrong levers.
Sure. Hilary, your final word this week?
Talking productivity and health, 3 basic principles: quality work environment, quality patient care, good outcomes for New Zealand, and the best use of resources.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you, Bill. That's it for the show. Check out our Facebook site for ongoing union campaigns and actions, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thanks for watching Aotearoa. Join us again 8 p.m. next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.